So, good evening, good afternoon, possibly even good morning, depending where you're joining us from. Welcome to the first Lacan in Scotland event for this academic year. We haven't done anything since May, so it's great to be back. And we're very privileged tonight to have Sinan Richards from King's College London joining us. Sinan's going to be talking about Solange Faladé, who is a figure from the Lacanian world who I certainly was completely unfamiliar with, and I imagine many of you are unfamiliar with. So it's a real privilege to be amongst the first in the English-speaking world to have these doors open for us. So thank you very much, Sinan, for generously bringing this to us and for joining us tonight. The format, for those of you who've not joined us before, Sinan will present for about 45 minutes, and then we will have another 45 minutes for discussion. And I've had the privilege of reading a version of what Sinan's going to present, so I know that you will have a lot of questions because really interesting stuff to come. So without further ado, Sinan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Calum. Let me just share my screen and then get to it. Hang on. Okay, so thank you, Calum. Thank you to Lacan Scotland as well. I'm really happy to be here. I'd also like to thank Derek Hook, for talking me through some of this material in the last week or so. So I want to begin the talk with a little bit of context and also some of the limitation. I just want to flag some of the limitations of the talk. Solange Faladé is a remarkable figure in the history of Lacanian psychoanalysis that has been unfairly sidelined. As I hope to be able to show, Faladé was very close to Lacan. They often traveled together. He trusted her profoundly, and she was a vital member of his school. However, quite apart from Lacan, Faladé is a remarkable figure in her own right. Faladé provided a series of seminars, as we will see, that cemented her as one of the better close readers of Lacan's psychophilosophy. Faladé's works are some of the first interpretations of Lacan's seminars after his death in 1980. She has not been translated and is virtually unknown in the Anglosphere and barely known in France. So this talk emerged from a paper I've written for the Modern Contemporary France Journal, which should be published very shortly. This is only an introduction to the life and work of Solange Faladé, and I'm inviting us all to look at this material and to evaluate it and to write about it. I will not be able to discuss everything and monetize everything, and here I am obliquely referring to Lacan, who jokingly said in 1967, he says, because of course I didn't have the time to say everything, to monetize everything. Well, don't think that as long as I live, you'll be able to take any of my formulas as definitive. I still have other tricks in my little bag of tricks. But in all seriousness, my sincere hope is that Faladé gains wider recognition, that her work gets translated very soon, and that her work on racism and psychoanalysis can be assessed fairly. My talk will roughly be divided into a kind of biographical introduction of Faladé and then a close reading of her work on racism in South Africa. So Solange Adelola Faladé is not well known, yet she ought to be. Over the course of 50 years, Faladé, a close friend and disciple of Jacques Lacan, published widely. She served patients in a clinical and psychoanalytic setting. She delivered seminars to students of psychoanalysis and was a consultant to the World Health Organization. But those are not nearly all of Faladé's successes. Faladé not only founded the Institut of African Ethnopsychopathology, but was a researcher in social anthropology at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, the CNRS. Most of Faladé's published works are transcripts of her seminars. For example, Clinique des névroses, Le moi et la question du sujet, and Autour de la chose. However, Faladé also published in journals and edited collections throughout her life. For example, a chapter in Femmes d'Afrique Noire entitled Femmes de Dakar, Women of Dakar. In her psychoanalytic theory, we skipped this slide, but it doesn't matter. In her psychoanalytic theory, Faladé developed an original theory of race and racism. Beginning in May 1999, during a session of her seminar Autour de la chose, Faladé chose to exemplify the psychoanalytical and racial implications of her orthodox Lacanian teachings by discussing the end of negotiations between Nelson Mandela and Frederik de Klerk that inaugurated the beginning of the end of apartheid in South Africa, creating with it a multiracial state and democracy, as we will see. The notion of multiracialism is crucial to Faladé's psychoanalytic theory of race. From 1994 until her death 10 years later, Faladé would further develop her psychoanalytic understanding of race and racism in her seminars, and in, among other places, speeches in Martinique in 1995 and France in 97 and 98. Faladé's core argument was that racism does not emerge rationally as an empirically verifiable fact of human existence, which is to say that race cannot be biologically separated from culture, and that therefore it is a hatred of other people's cultures and languages. As Faladé explains, and this is the quote on the slides, somewhere Lacan says that race has nothing to do with biology. For example, the erroneous work done by anthropologists who try to find differences. They look for palm creases, they measure foreheads, they look at the genes, whatever, but that's not what makes a race. End quote. Instead, for Faladé and Lacan, race exists because it is intimately related to discourse, language, culture, and tradition. Racism is a fear and hatred of others' languages, cultures, and religions, a deep and violent refusal to share jouissance and let others enjoy, jouir de, their differences. We might already be able to see how Faladé's theory can serve as a profound critique of political assimilation in contemporary race relations debates in Western countries. Not unlike other potentially better known figures, for example, Ferdinand Deligny, Faladé worked with autistic children at the Fondation Parents de Rosan under the close supervision of Dr. Jenny Aubry, who is actually Elizabeth Roudinesco's mother. And according to Roudinesco herself, Faladé was a close personal confidant of Lacan. Lacan not only entrusted Faladé to draft the constitutions of the École Freudienne de Paris, but as Robert Schamischer puts it, Solange Faladé has been called forth on several occasions to draft the statutes of the École Freudienne de Paris, the Cause Freudienne, and the École de la Cause Freudienne. Furthermore, Lacan nominated Faladé to be the treasurer of his school, and she also served a stint as vice president, which suggests that Faladé was a central figure in the administrative and intellectual structure of the École Freudienne de Paris, helping shape, according to Schamischer, the political decisions of the institution. For instance, it was actually Faladé's idea to tape record Lacan's seminars, and she undertook the first recordings herself in 1962 for Seminar 10 on anxiety. It is worth noting here that Faladé only started delivering seminars at the urging of Jacques Lacan. By all accounts, Faladé lived a remarkable life that is wholly absent from all critical scholarship on race and psychoanalysis in both the Anglosphere and in most of the Francophone world. As a Franco-African woman, Faladé immigrated to France from Benin in 1934 at the age of 8 to live with her maternal uncle. She was soon recognized as a brilliant young student, having passed the traditional baccalaureate with emphases on both Latin and ancient Greek. Faladé was the descendant of the Yoruba people from the kingdom of Dahomey, present-day Benin, which from 1904 became a French colony. Faladé moved from classical studies into medicine and became a trainee consultant at Parisian hospitals, where she met Lacan. Faladé held multiple senior positions at various institutions throughout her life, beginning as early as 1951, while she was still a doctoral student at the Faculté de Médecine at the Université de Paris. Faladé was elected president of the Federation of Black African Students of France, the organization that published the journal The Black African Student. The Federation of Black African Students of France was set up during two congresses, one in April 1950 in Lyon, where Fanon was studying at the same time, and one in Bordeaux in December 1950. It aimed to build links with student groups from North Africa and Madagascar and other areas, to form an anti-colonialist student front in Paris. It is worth noting that not everyone was supportive of Faladé's tenure, and indeed, in this snarky and sexist rant, Ouzan Coulibaly, who was also a member of the Federation of Black African Students of France, stated, and I'm quoting, "Miss Faladé is not very dynamic and she is a woman," end quote. Faladé was the first and only woman to be president of the Federation of Black African Students of France, and she, after she resigned as president, she would remain actively involved in the society. By 1955, Faladé published her doctoral thesis, Contributions to a Study on Infantile Development in Sub-Saharan Africa. In this thesis, Faladé discusses the important psychomotor benefits for infants of parents carrying children on their backs. Her sister, Géraldine Faladé, explains, Solange was the first to discuss a practice that was considered primitive at the time, but whose benefits for the development of infants and children are now widely recognized. After Faladé defended her doctoral thesis, she applied to work at a Dakar hospital, but was denied the job by the French colonial authorities. Instead, she continued attending Lacan seminars, and she attended alongside figures such as Jean Houry, François Tosquiès, and Françoise Dolto. Lacan would become her psychoanalyst and remain her teacher for the rest of his life, and she would remain faithful to his particular strand of psychoanalysis. In line with her doctoral work, by 1962, 7 years later, Faladé had set up the Institute of African Ethno-Psychopathology, and reporting on the rationale for creating this institute in the Journal of African Studies, Faladé writes, the psychopathology of sub-Saharan Africans is little known. No systematic study of it has been conducted to date. And one of the aims of her institute would be to systematically investigate the psychopathology of sub-Saharan Africans. From the outside, it might seem a little unfair to suggest that, quote, no systematic study, end quote, had been carried out on the psychopathology of sub-Saharan Africans, given the publication of, at the very least, Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks in 1952, of which Faladé would have no doubt been aware. However, Fanon's study was specifically about the impact of colonization on the Black man and people of color more generally, and not specifically the psychopathology of sub-Saharan Africans and the relevance and application of traditional medicine. Moreover, Black Skin, White Masks does not explicitly treat the psychopathology of sub-Saharan Africans in the systematic way that Faladé is seeking, in the sense that, for Faladé, a rigorous investigation into psychological, economic, social, cultural, discursive, and geographic analyses by sub-Saharan Africans themselves was the Institute's aim, as we will see. In the founding proceedings, she stresses the importance of traditional medicines in sub-Saharan Africa. She says, Africans themselves had and still have a profound understanding of the disorders presented by the mentally ill, and had developed real psychotherapeutic methods, which are still applied to this day, even when the patients are hospitalized. These traditional methods enable these subjects who suffer from mental and affective disorders to adapt to daily life, often extremely well. In a remarkable passage that has strong echoes to Fanon's argument about approaches to mental health in North Africa, Faladé suggests that traditional African medicines have something to teach the Western conceptions of treatment of mental disorders. Indeed, Faladé adds that the introduction into sub-Saharan Africa of elements from a different civilization, of Western concepts, has had the effect, among other things, of alienating new generations from traditional conceptions of mental illness and psychotherapy. There is an urgent need to gather this knowledge before those who hold it disappear. Faladé highlights the work of, for example, Dr. Ande Oyelambo and Dr. Tigani El-Mahi as essential contributions from colleagues in English-speaking African countries, and set up the Institute of African Ethno-Psychopathology as a francophone alternative to working towards a common aim of the advancement of African-led psychology and psychopathology. Faladé says the priority ought to be a reciprocal epistemological exchange to understand mental illness. She says a profound, stable, and beneficial relationship can only be established through reciprocal psychological understanding. This research thus exceeds the clinical and psychiatric domains. It also aims to develop, a bilateral teaching, a reciprocal illumination of the white man and the black man, the consequences of which are obvious in all domains of activity. That is to say, the Institute's impact exceeds by far the area of mental health. End quote. Faladé's research program for this institute was to, on the one hand, study the psychopathologies de l'homme d'Afrique noire, of sub-Saharan African man, and, on the other, to create an inventory of the psychotherapeutic methods used in traditional Africa, as well as, quote, in parallel, train African researchers, end quote. Interestingly, the scientific committee of the Institute of African Ethnopsychopathology attests to the fact that Faladé was not seeking an empirically focused positivist psychiatry or ethnography, and instead she composed a supervisory committee that brought in philosophers, historians, psychoanalysts, and social anthropologists, among others, for example, including Jacques Lacan, Daniel Lagache, Claude Lévi-Strauss, Pontalis et Laplanche, among others. Faladé's institute prepared a preliminary biography of the crucial texts and traditions that dealt with the problems of conceptualizing mental illness and somatic illnesses in sub-Saharan Africa. Finally, in concluding her report on the first year's activity of the Institute, Faladé says prophetically that, and this is a kind of long quote, so just bear with me, we did not want to lapse into a transculturalism without nuance, which, inheriting from traditional humanism, would postulate that, quote, man is the same in all epochs and all places, end quote. This would constitute a flattening perspective, abolishing by definition all scientific research, whilst being, moreover, only deceitfully humanitarian, insofar as it would risk negating the specificity and the genius of each to engulf man in an abstraction. Likewise, we wanted to avoid what we would call the romanticism of difference. One knows to which scientific and political aberrations it can lead. Treating men as curiosities, it outright objectifies them in their difference, ignoring their lived experience and the direction of their aspirations. For Faladé, difference, not individualism, must be preserved and not eviscerated in favor of a humanitarian universalism, but at the same time, not romanticized as a curiosity into which so much of the Western ethnological sciences have erred, to put it generously. Instead, for Faladé, any discussion of difference must always be held alongside the necessity of a fundamental dignity in living together well. Faladé means this difference in almost the exact same way as Lacan's non-relation, truce of the sexes. It is striking how Faladé's plea for not homogenizing difference is also similar to Édouard Glissant's concept of opacity from the Poetics of Relation. As Patrick Crowley states, opacity is not to be confused with obscurantism or apartheid. It simply refuses to yield itself. It resists a certain mode of thought that seeks to know, or rather to categorize the world and thus reduce its diversity to the false clarity of universal models. This is a quote direct from Glissant. And he, as Glissant puts it himself, he says, accepting difference does, of course, upset the hierarchy of this scale. I understand your difference, or in other words, without creating a hierarchy, I relate it to my norm. I admit you to existence within my system. I create you afresh. But perhaps we need to bring an end to the very notion of scale, displace all reduction. Glissant's demand to displace hierarchy is comparable to Faladé's plea for difference and diversity in 1962 in the fields of mental health and social anthropology, where she demanded that scientific action not flatten and homogenize difference. As we might have already recognized, Faladé's relationship to sub-Saharan Africa anti-colonization and the advancement of African students and formerly colonized people in the West was never too far from her causes and her work, whether it be with the CNRS, president of the African Students Federation, or at her Institute of African Ethno-Psychopathology. This is why it is not at all surprising that after Lacan's death, Faladé chose to inaugurate her psychoanalytic school from Dakar, even though Lacan's last will and testament was to have Faladé, Charles Melman, and Jacques Lacan jointly run la Fondation de la Cause Freudienne. Miller, nevertheless, shunned Faladé and instead created the École de la Cause Freudienne. It was for this reason that Faladé created her own psychoanalytic school and foundation, confusingly also called the École Freudienne. As Samasher put it, and this is the quote on the screen, it was in Dakar, on African soil, that Solange Faladé wrote the act of foundation for the Freudian School on the 7th of April, 1983. And before we move on to kind of part two of this talk, I just wanted to take a moment to comment on the fact that we so often understand Lacan's use of algebra as mathemes. We all use the word mathemes, but actually Faladé had suggested the word algorithms, and she was shot down in a sense by Jacques Lacan, who chose mathemes almost in a sense to spite her. But actually, I couldn't help but wonder and think if algorithms was not just a better use, was it just a better word for the use of kind of Lacan's use of algebra, especially the way that the term algorithms is so ubiquitous nowadays. So that's food for thought. So I think now we turn to Faladé's this one aspect on race of Faladé's psychoanalytic work. Faladé explains in Autour de la chose, which is this book around the thing, that her theory of racism stems directly from Lacan's theory of racism, saying racism arises in the act of wanting to force he who enjoys in a certain way to enjoy like the other. Vouloir obliger celui qui jouit d'une certaine façon à jouir comme l'autre, à se présenter comme l'autre, c'est là que le racisme se fait. We could add that this is also an excellent definition of misogyny, homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and any other objectable phobias based on the hatred of difference. For Faladé, jouissance is crucial within the Lacanian framework to understand and therefore defeat hatred. In fact, Lacan and Faladé's views are that any discourse of assimilation, any attempt to force a homogeneous cultural context or environment, preventing jouissance for anybody, and any attempt to oblige such a homogeneous cultural context is racist, a stifling violence. We might already be able to see why this view of racism emerged around the same time as the horrors of South African apartheid. But before trying to develop Faladé's theory of race that heavily interprets and makes use of jouissance, I think we need to spend a little bit of time appreciating Lacan's concept of jouissance itself. Jouissance is a complex and multifaceted concept, and of course, I'm speaking at Lacan in Scotland, so I expect you all to know. But for the benefit of everyone, I will just as easily as possible try and explain the aspects of jouissance that are relevant to Faladé at this one moment. So the following definition is both much too brief and inexact. Still, to put it as simply as possible, in this context, we should think of unrestricted jouissance as the subject refusing any power, any limits on their power. Jouissance is an intersubjective concept, and we should think of it as a shareable libidinal substance between subjects. Indeed, for our purposes here, it might also be helpful to think about it in terms of a finite libidinal substance, which is to say that it ought to be apportionable among subjects and negotiated along ethical values for all to partially enjoy. It is for this reason that Lacan specifically talks about the enjoyment of the organ of the other and why the sexual relationship does not exist, since one cannot possess the whole. For Faladé and Lacan, the white colonizer is a hoarder of jouissance and therefore stealing jouissance from others, preventing others from bodily and psychical enjoyment. Lacan explains this straightforwardly in Seminar 20 in Autour, when he relates the legal concept usufruct to jouissance. In French civil law, usufruct is the right to use a property or a good, codifying a process where a freeholder might let an individual use a property in question. Lacan says, and I quote, and this is the quote that's on the screen, usufruct means that you can enjoy, jouir de, your means, but you must not waste them. When you have the usufruct of an inheritance, this is Lacan speaking, you can enjoy the inheritance as long as you don't use too much of it. Using a legal concept, usufruct, Lacan says that with jouissance, we as subjects have free access to enjoyment, to jouissance. Yet, in order to prevent total hedonistic chaos, where some subjects overstep the jouissance of other subjects, we must renounce some of our jouissance for us to live together well. The paradigmatic example Lacan provides is the desire for incest. Lacan shows how the subject's unrestricted desire for incest must be restricted, castrated, for human subjects to form typical libidinal relations. One cannot partake in acts of incest without psychically, at least, damaging oneself and the other and even future subjects. It is an unrestricted, pure violence inflicted on the world. Therefore, this castration of the desire for incest is what happens in the archetypal development of human sexuality through the symbolic order, the no of the father, as it were. And there's a wonderful homophony in French. The name of the father, le nom du père, is also the no of the father, le nom du père, as I'm sure we all know. But then again, Lacan complicated the situation around Seminar 21 when he says les noms du père, which means the non-dupes are, which is a really interesting concept, but probably we don't have time. So this whole system of Lacanian complex libidinal castration is an attempt to usher in some form of intersubjective trans-historical harmony into the world. Therefore, like incest, we can understand white supremacy or any murderous genocidal act of violence as a form of unrestricted pure jouissance, where no limit has been adopted. Geneviève Morel puts it in ambiguïté sexuelle. She says, because it implies the destruction of the homeostasis required by the pleasure principle, neither too much nor too little, jouissance then also designates the excess of pleasure, a satisfaction that is too intense. Therefore, for Lacan, jouissance always comes at a price. He says, for what I call jouissance, this is an unpublished text from 1967. Lacan says, for what I call jouissance is always at the order of tension, forcing, expenditure, or even exploit. And in the context of Faladé and racism, the desire for white supremacy is a form of unrestricted jouissance, which inflicts an unrecoverable violence on the world that Faladé will suggest needs to be costed for and castrated, which is precisely what she says Nelson Mandela managed to achieve. Faladé's theory of racism and jouissance allows us to understand and rectify asymmetric acts of genocidal violence and discrimination. So she begins this speech in 1997, which is her first kind of foray into thinking about these ideas. And she's in Martinique, in Fort-de-France. And she develops quite beautifully this theory of multiracialism, as I'll explain now. Addressing an audience that included Aimé Césaire himself, who came to listen to Faladé speak, Faladé directly addresses Césaire when she states, tonight, I'm glad I have a chance to address the people of Martinique, in this country where a century ago lived the father of my father, Ben Zahim, King of Abomey, Master Aimé Césaire, I am greatly honored that you have come to hear me speak today. Today, I will attempt to talk about another historical event, a current event, the meeting between Nelson Mandela and Frederik de Klerk. And of course, the Mandela and de Klerk meeting occurred in apartheid South Africa, which, as Derek Cook puts it in Lacan and Race, quote, was a system of apartheid that remains perhaps the most egregious historical site of institutionalized white supremacist racism available to living memory, end quote. And it is in this context that Faladé begins her talk by picking up Lacan's work on Plato's Symposium concerning the Greek myth of Pinia and Porus, which he develops in Seminar 8 on transference. So, Faladé continues. She wants to talk about this seminar, which Lacan says the Greek myth, offers two archetypal subjective positions, the poor and the rich. So Faladé starts. She says, on the one hand, the poor, who is devoid of everything. On the other hand, the rich, who has all the resources. And it seems to me that Nelson Mandela and Frederik de Klerk were there in their positions, which it has been given to us to know, illustrating these two subjective positions. I want to say immediately that this is not an applied psychoanalysis, and this is certainly not about considering what can be a symptom in one or the other. This is about a very different question. So Faladé clearly does not seek to analyze either Mandela or de Klerk, and the point of her psychoanalytic analysis is entirely different. Instead, Faladé seeks to use psychoanalytic theory as social theory to make an ethical and political argument about race, racism, and Black lives in South Africa and across the world. Relating Mandela's decision to work as a human rights lawyer instead of accepting the path laid out by his parents, Faladé shows how Mandela initiated a break, une coupure, with his paternally decided destiny, and how this choice resulted in him being devoid of all freedom, forced to live the life of a true prisoner. Having to break stones, she says, quote, in the glaring sun, in short, living how the poor really live, end quote. Faladé, therefore, means something entirely different when she relates Mandela to Pinia. For Faladé, Mandela as a parable really was Pinia. His personal and political lives mirrored each other, and he, quote, continued the struggle in his own way where he was with his companions. In Plato's Symposium, according to Lacan, Faladé explains, quote, Pinia, the poor woman, was not allowed to attend the feast of the gods, a feast held in honor of the birth of Aphrodite. This did not discourage her. She set off, strained and exhausted herself, collected everything she could on the way, and arrived at the feast just when Porus, the rich, was leaving. The latter, full of resources, was leaving the room where the feast was held, inebriated with the nectar of the gods. I messed that up. He was inebriated with the nectar of the gods. Full stop. Pinia moved towards him, met him in the garden, where he had gone to rest, the garden of the gods. During this meeting, she became pregnant with love. We are told that the contents of this myth bear witness to what makes the communication between gods and humans possible. Ce qui est là, nous dit-on, dans ce mythe, porte témoignage de ce qui rend possible la communication entre les dieux et les humains. For Faladé, there is something admirable and audacious in the way that Pinia directly approaches the rich Porus, creating and instituting her own dignity, putting herself in front of gods, making it possible to communicate with the gods and co-generate. Indeed, a child, Eros, love, is born from this encounter between Pinia and Porus. Quote, she became pregnant with love, Faladé tells us. So Mandela, with his companions, had to strain himself, like the poor Pinia had to do, Faladé says, quote, so that in his turn, he could be admitted to the feast of the gods, end quote. It would be a mistake to understand Faladé casting Mandela as Pinia, as presenting him as a humiliated beggar, seeking riches from the resources from Porus. Instead, the lesson Faladé intends to convey is the audacity of Pinia's walk over to Porus at the Garden of the Gods, and the self-dignifying quality of the audaciousness of such an act. As Faladé explains, de Klerk was truly in the position of Porus, and I think that there is reason to pay him a tribute, and I believe that we cannot qualify him differently than how Mandela himself did when replying to the journalist who questioned him during François Mitterrand's visit. Mandela is speaking now, quoted by Faladé. Mandela says, "We find him admirable," end quote. But why does Faladé take up Mandela's own words on de Klerk? She says, quote, "Why is he admirable? It is because the rich, because he has, cannot be on the side of those who give, on the side of those who can love. To love is to give what one does not have, and it is indeed the poor who can do that." So what did de Klerk do for us to find him admirable today? Faladé asks. Taking up Lacan's famous formula that to love is to give what you do not have, Faladé makes Lacan's argument that Porus or de Klerk cannot love. And for Faladé, the admirable thing that de Klerk did was accept to lose some of his own jouissance and forego the unrestricted jouissance of the white colonizer in South Africa, to accept to love in loss. It's that, and I'm quoting Faladé here, and I believe this is the quote on the slide, it's that he who had enjoyment, jouissance, he who had power, who was at that moment the man who could decide upon everything, he understood, he grasped that he needed to renounce something of his jouissance, this jouissance which locked him and his people in on themselves, end quote. The words that Faladé uses here, locked him and his people in on themselves, have a remarkable resonance with how Jean Houry defines psychosis in 11 heures du soir à Laborde, 11 in the evening at Laborde. Houry says, and I'm quoting Houry, "We could define psychosis as the impossibility of containing the void, l'impossibilité d'enfermer le vide," which is to say that there is something psychotic in holding the unrestricted power of jouissance in the way the white colonial leadership did during South African apartheid, in its unrestricted violence and degradation, resulting in the spilling out of all unrestricted jouissance. As Lacan put it in 1967, again in this text that's not been translated, he says, "There is undisputably enjoyment at that point where pain begins to appear," end quote. The important point for Faladé is that de Klerk accepted the pain of the loss, accepted that he was wrong, and had to contain the unrestricted jouissance of the white colonizer, the pure evil desire of white supremacy. Because for Faladé, and Faladé says that she will allow herself Lacan's wordplay. She says, jouissance, jouissance, i.e., enjoyment, and the homophonous counter in French, hear sense, I hear meaning. She says, it must become jouissance with the two possibilities of hearing the meaning, d'entendre le sens, and the fact of being able to enjoy something in the sense that means one has accepted a loss. The meaning, le sens, Lacan insists, is what makes communication possible, end quote. For Lacan, the importance of sonority is key. Jouissance, hearing sense. De Klerk, hearing the dignified radical demands of Mandela. For Faladé, de Klerk managed to achieve what most patients can only hope to accomplish during the course of an analysis, the introspection that allows the patient to recognize that we cannot possess unrestricted desire, that ethics, living together well, requires the communication and cooperation that only appears once jouissance in its radical sense is castrated, given up. And so Faladé puts it like this. She says, from the moment when the dialogue had been installed, from the moment when he who possessed had to recognize in the other who is not the same, certainly, possibilities of identification. From that moment onwards, Mandela could claim that right to vote. And you remember what an extraordinary day that was. That day, which lasted more than a day, when the whole of South Africa, all of those who live in the country, be they white, be they black, be they Indian or mixed race, when they all put their voices, their ballots, in that box. Faladé's theory, incorporating Lacan's theory of jouissance, is ingenious, because the only way to move forward was for de Klerk to lose something. Recognizing this loss enabled the dialogue, the coming together, and the healing to begin. Of course, Faladé explains that the genius of Mandela, the true mark of his political skill, was that rather than create, as was feared, a black state, he suggested a multiracial state. And in doing so, he completely broke away from what had been imposed on them, him and his people, up until that point, since they had wanted to make that country, which was theirs, a white state. Instead of revisiting the fascistic ethno-nationalism of the colonizer and trying to create the conditions of oppressing a minority, Mandela, from the outset, limited his own jouissance. He accepted the limit and in so doing created a multiracial state. As Faladé puts it, quote, "For us psychoanalysts, it's not about inferiority or superiority, it's about what makes difference. C'est autour de ce qui fait la différence. It's about what makes difference." Which is to say that Faladé is arguing that it is not a question of subsuming porous into penia or forcing black to assimilate to white. Instead, the central Lacanian Faladéan lesson is how to live together without assimilating or homogenizing differences, and instead keeping them both on an equal footing. For Lacan and Faladé, it is absolutely not a question of tolerance. The tolerance is both refusing to give up jouissance, only hiding it, and staying within a superiority complex. Whereas for Faladé, multiracialism is the wager of living alongside each other well, without denying anyone their difference. And it is in this context that Faladé argues that the entire way that we think about race needs to be thought differently. She says, race is not only what physical anthropology tells us. Race is not only the crease in the palm, which means that we are not the same. It is not only those measurements which anthropometrics can highlight. Instead, she offers this extremely rich definition of race. She says, no, race is something else. It is what means that we can enjoy differently. C'est ce qui fait qu'on jouit différemment. It's in the different modes of enjoyment which separate us. And I think that what lies here, or at least what we attempt to attain, is that while we enjoy differently, we can nevertheless present ourselves to the feast of the gods. We can nevertheless enjoy everything that this country can bring while respecting the other, who is the semblant other, l'autre semblable. This is also what psychoanalysis teaches us. The idea is not to be the same. We are other, but a semblant other. And if we respect that semblant other, we also respect the way that other enjoys. On respecte aussi sa façon de jouir. And I believe that is one of the important points for us, which must make us react, must enable us to ensure that each of us, with our other ways of enjoying what life brings, we may continue to converse with each other. But I believe we must be proud, I am at any rate, that here in our homeland, chez nous, for it is indeed ours, what has been called that black race up till now, that population which has suffered as it has, can today teach such a lesson to the world. But what is the lesson? Faladé's point is that in having chosen the path of multiracialism, the black race has taught the world a lesson in dignity and audacity, just as Penia's walk had done. Mandela's demand from the semblant other to recognize the unjust wielding of their jouissance is, in a sense, according to Faladé, exactly what Lacan meant when in Seminar 20, Encore, he refers to overstepping the usufruct of jouissance, and how jouissance belongs to us all and can only be enjoyed in moderation. We cannot hoard jouissance without losing our capacity for love. In Faladé's theory, there is a demand for radical equality and a lesson of respecting each other's way of enjoying differently. The respecter sa façon de jouir, respecting other people's jouissance, is crucial in any psychoanalytic understanding of racism. For Faladé, this impulse is clearly, quote, a right to share jouissance with everyone, which again parallels Edouard Glissant's call for opacity when he says we clamor for the right of opacity for everyone. For Sophie Mendelssohn and Livio Boni in their book La vie psychique du racisme, Faladé's interpretation of Lacan's theory of racism allows her to sidestep Lacan's fatalism. Quote, this is from Mendelssohn and Boni. The South African conjecture enables her to find a less fatalistic path. Since for Lacan, and this is me now, not Mendelssohn and Boni, since for Lacan, the social field is always asphyxiating, and jouissance in man's hands will always find a way to be out of balance again. Whereas for Mendelssohn and Boni, Faladé's theory allows for a more hopeful outcome. Quote, it can, however, have a happier destiny when it serves only as a preamble to the relaunch of the process through a partial identification to the enjoyment of the other, as de Klerk shows himself capable of doing when he allows Black people to vote. End quote. Which is to say that for Faladé, there is not necessarily a universally symmetrical system of identification where all is homogeneously flattened, but rather, as Mendelssohn and Boni point out, Faladé is closer to Edouard Glissant's nuanced view of the relationship of difference to difference. The relationship becomes relationships of difference to difference, and the relation then draws the territory in which all the differences of the world are inscribed. As Glissant puts it, the relation is the realized quantity of all the differences in the world, just like it used to be said that the universe is constituted of an infinite quantity of atoms. I don't think that Faladé's argument wishes itself to be a kind of liberal multiculturalism. The jouir de, enjoying of one's own difference, is emphatically not multicultural. It is not an invitation to share in culture or understand each other, necessarily. Faladé really means it in the way that Lacan meant the non-rapport between the sexes when he talks about gender difference, which really is radical, since there is no way to ever bridge that gap between the subject and the other. Each has a way of seeing the world that is incompatible with the other, but that does not preclude a truce or a kind of living together well, and indeed intimately. For Faladé, Pina's position is much closer to the woman in Lacan, which is to say that for Faladé, Mandela is not demanding to be subsumed into the one, but rather for racial difference to be taken one by one. The racial equivalent of the feminine position. It seems to me that Glissant is aiming for the same idea. Glissant's opacity is exactly that. We will never see eye to eye, but why should we? Ultimately, Faladé is an orthodox Lacanian. Her radicality or lack thereof mirrors the radicality or lack thereof of Lacan, depending on how you see it, which is why I am tempted to understand this argument in the context of the quite radical way of understanding the non-relation of the sexes. Faladé's multiracialism is that there is an unbridgeable difference that exists, but that does not preclude a cohabiting well together. I'm reminded here of Lacan's quote about homelands in the Écrit. He says, "To these children, ladies and gentlemen, will henceforth be two homelands, towards which each of their souls will take flight on divergent wings, and regarding which it will be all the more impossible for them to reach an agreement, since being in fact the same homeland, neither can give ground regarding the one's unsurpassed excellence without detracting from the other's glory." There is difference, but there's also living together. And with Faladé, just as we can have a theory of multiracialism, we can also have a theory of multi-genders. The only thing that matters is that we respect the way that others enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you, Sinan. That was absolutely fantastic. We're going to open up to questions shortly. We're going to open to questions now, but rather than wait for people to put their hands up, I'm going to start asking questions. And as and when you have questions you'd like to ask Sinan or points you want to make and bring into the discussion, then, as I said before, just stick up your Zoom hand and we will unmute you and bring you in. So I found the end of your talk, I was getting very involved in your argument there, and I had lots of questions popping into my head. You actually seemed to address my questions before I got a chance to ask them. I was reminded in your references to, or your use of the graph of sexuation or the formulas of sexuation as a way of thinking about race reminded me a lot of some of Sheldon George's arguments around how we can utilize that algorithm, as I think you quite rightly call it. We can utilize that in various different social contexts, which I find both fascinating and while it helps us understand certain things, it also opens up a number of questions. I think there's still quite a lot of work to be done there. But rather, I'll maybe come back to that. I wanted to start off by asking you something slightly broader in terms of this idea of Lacan used, as seems to be done, it's becoming more and more popular, this idea of using Lacan as a way of understanding race, when Lacan actually says very little about race in his own writing. So there's kind of an odd use of Lacan there. But I just want to start off with a quote from Faladé herself, and she says, I took this from your paper, she says, the introduction into Africaine, sub-Saharan Africa, of elements from a different civilization, of Western concepts, has the effect of, among other things, of alienating new generations. And in the specific context that she's talking about issues of mental health, but the broader idea that she's expressing there. I just wonder in what ways or to what extent is Lacan or Lacanian ideas, are they exempt from this danger? In what sense is Lacan not simply yet another introduction of Western ideas into a non-Western context that produces yet another form of alienation?
Oh, I was already unmuted. Thank you so much for your question. That's really interesting. I think Lacan addresses this point himself, whether he's talking about psychoanalysis in Japan or when he's talking about colonization. I think it's in Seminar 17. He specifically says that, and I think I can remember the quote, he says, we sold them Oedipus when we sold them colonization, or when we colonized them at the same time we sold them Oedipus. And Lacan's position was that effectively psychoanalysis is completely pointless outside of a kind of Western framework. The reason why it might sometimes be useful in a kind of colonial context is because precisely we have sold them our version of Oedipus. But he says specifically about Japan, he says, well, actually, there's no relevance. There's no way to understand Japanese culture within the kind of Lacanian symbolic. You'd have to think it again from scratch. So I think that Lacan kind of provides the answer there. I think people tend to think that Lacan. I mean, there's a lot of hearsay and kind of rumors swirling around about this guy, but he was very precise, and he wrote about a lot of stuff that people have seemingly forgotten. But I think he would be the first to say that I think Lacanian psychoanalysis is just damaging in other cultural contexts.
But how does that sit with Faladé's idea of taking Lacanian ideas to sub-Saharan Africa. Then you describe her as an orthodox Lacanian, but there seems to be something potentially quite Lacanian in its unorthodoxy in the way that she's being orthodox.
So I think Faladé's point in 1962 was not to take Western conceptions of psychiatry or psychoanalysis to Africa. It was to get different conceptions of psychopathology from Africa, to kind of track and to kind of save a lot of ideas, traditional ideas of African psychopathology that was being lost in this kind of move to adopting the kind of Western scientific psychiatric model, which is something that Lacan would agree with ultimately, because Lacan was not someone who agreed with dominant views of psychopathology in the 1930s in France. Lacan was famously anti-empiricist and anti-positivist, and his attempts to break out of his medical degree and work with the surrealists is well documented and well tracked. So I think that's why Faladé appealed to him in a sense, because he was always looking to kind of break out of this rather restrictive scientific positivist view of mental disease that I think that he thought was basically totally worthless.
And it's in her endeavor to recuperate it, to save, to stop the fading of these traditional conceptions and traditional approaches. And she talks about there being a lack of systematic study or systematic documentation of these approaches. Was she successful in documenting that or initiating that documentation?
I think that the Institute ran for a few years. I don't know how successful it was. I know that she managed to translate up to about 261, not translate, but track 261 texts from various of the kind of tribal peoples of sub-Saharan Africa that she was looking at, which is not bad going. And it was a team effort. It was not all her own work. It was very much a kind of group of academics, social anthropologists, but psychoanalysts, philosophers, historians, people like, as I mentioned, Claude Lévi-Strauss, etc., who they all kind of worked together in order to try and harness and kind of itemize, I guess, some of the traditional African medicines with regards to psychopathology.
Okay, interesting. And it seemed to me when in the latter part of your talk, and you're talking about this idea of the idea of difference, the particular way of conceiving difference, I thought that was very well laid out for us there, in the way that thinking of difference in a way that is not I think the way you describe a homogenized difference, but where there's difference of difference. Does this notion still rely on a kind of Fanonian idea of universality, though? We need to understand humanity, even when humanity may not be something we can. Well, there's a danger in encapsulating humanity as a unity that, in the sense that that's almost immediately falls back into an imposition of an idea. So, classic colonial idea of, there is humanity and it's in the model of the white colonialists, and we don't really need to go any further than that. And yeah, how do you're kind of pointing towards an idea of universality, and is it a similar move to Fanon's move that Faladé is making here? Is that how you would understand it?
I think I don't really know. I think the kind of the verdict's out and the jury's out. We don't know. I think the way that I understood her idea was ultimately that, and I kind of signaled this in the use of glissant, but I guess in many ways we could also use Fanon. I think it's the idea in Lacan that it's two divergent wings on the same flight. That the difference exists, but that there's a kind of unity around that, to put it in kind of really broad terms, that I think is the kind of idea that she's grasping for, and a very Lacanian one at that. I think, I think, I don't think, I don't know, but I don't know. It's an interesting question. I don't know necessarily what the answer is. I know that for her, as an orthodox Lacanian, I interpreted her theory to be very much in line with the way that Lacan describes the relationship of the sexes. Whether that's linked to Fanon, that would, I think, require much more thought. But I don't know, actually, is the answer.
Okay. I want to pick up later.
Totally.
Right. I see some hands up, so I'm going to open it up to other people so I don't hog you. So Amir.
Hi, I just, that was fantastic. Thank you. I just put my question in the chat box if you can read through it, because it took me a bit of a time to articulate that.
Do you want me to read that?
That would be fantastic. Yeah, thank you.
Do you not want to explain it? I think you'd probably do a much better job.
All right. So the question is addressing what Calum was saying about the relevance of the Lacanian psychoanalysis to non-Western and how you addressed it. So I was wondering, what do you can comment on the relevance of Faladé's theory or perspective, and by large Lacan's in this context, when it comes to the issue of what is now addressed as, especially in the media here, a migration crisis, especially when it comes to the encounters between the British and the non-Western, which we are actually talking about the British and the Muslims mostly. And what do you have also to add to that when it comes to the encounters between the second and so on generations of the migrants here culturally with the British, possibly addressing the British in a more traditionalist sense? Not everyone. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. I don't know what the relevance would be to the migrant crisis. Partly because I'm very ignorant, and I wouldn't feel confident to speak about it more than what's happening in the kind of popular press and the media. So I don't think I'm competent enough to discuss that. However, I think that behind your question was an idea of, what would kind of be the Lacanian Faladé response to kind of contemporary crises. And I'm struck by, when I was reading Faladé, that what she's responding to is an attempt to solve a crisis. And in a sense, her psychoanalysis, Lacanian psychoanalysis, comes too late. It's the classic joke, the Hegelian joke. But Klerk and Mandela, they had overcome, or at least attempted in this kind of early 90s optimism, to overcome a certain racial segregation that was abhorrent. But I think that underlying Faladé's argument is a kind of hopefulness that is potentially, and I signaled this slightly in the talk, that is potentially missing from the Lacanian, the kind of purely dogmatic Lacanian schema. Lacan is famously, in my view, fatalistic, whereas it seems that Faladé is not. And I think that the way that she talks about Mandela might even be, to our contemporary sensibilities, might be a little bit odd, because she's so enthusiastic in a way that we're not used to anymore. So it could be that Lacan was more useful in our contemporary conjecture to accept the hopelessness of it all. But again, I don't know.
Thanks, Amir, and thanks, Sinan. Maria.
Thanks so much for a brilliant talk, Sinan. Now I want the prequel as well, which I missed, the Canon prequel. But anyway, no, that was brilliant, and thank you very much. I guess I haven't really sort of first. I'm not surprised to hear that anecdote about Jacques Lacan. It fits with what we think about him now, and it's such a shame that he didn't let her call them algorithms. People would not be so put off by Lacan if they were called
maybe not
themes. I guess my question again follows from Amin actually and other people. Is about the end, of your talk and the, the hopeful idea that there might not be a sexual relationship, there was no rapport between genders or races, but what we have is some hope that we will tolerate or let each other enjoy.
Not tolerate,
accept or tolerate. I think Zizek in his misanthropic, he only goes as far as tolerate the neighbor, not love him. And I think that's the difference, isn't it? I mean, what's missing, like Amin was asking, is love. And because what makes up for the absence of the sexual relationship is precisely love. We make up for it in sometimes, but not often enough. And neither Freud nor Lacan were hopeful that we would make up for it amongst neighbors, only amongst our relatives and the people we fall in love with. So I think it's quite pessimistic. And I think what, from the picture you gave us of this, of Solange, that I wish I know more about a long time ago, is that she has enough love. She has lots of love. I mean, in fact, like you say, the way she describes both de Klerk and Mandela is a bit too. I wouldn't be so generous about what they ended up. Not even Mandela. I mean, Mandela didn't give any economic redistribution, which really mattered. He only gave, the right to vote. What do you do with the right to vote? You vote, and you're still homeless. So I think Solange is much more generous. I think she has. So she makes up for the love that Western, like Lacan and Freud did not count on. And unfortunately, what we are living now is this lack of love, unfortunately. So that would make up for all these impasses in the relationships. Anyway, thank you for a brilliant talk. Thank you. I'll mute.
Thank you so much, Maria. Honestly, that was a great comment and intervention. I think you're right, obviously, that the way that the political situation has developed in South Africa since then has obviously been a huge disappointment for a lot of people. And I think, again, she's writing, this speech was delivered in 1995. I mean, just after the kind of hope, you can almost imagine it, writing in 2008 after Obama won or whatever, and then seeing the kind of degradation of the way that things had happened since then. So I'd be tempted to forgive her on that one. But probably where I wouldn't forgive her is that it is too hopeful. This is my kind of strict Lacanian training. Lacan says in La Troisième, which is one of the Discours de Rome in Rome, he says, what does he say? He says, although it's impossible to make two into one, we try. We try. And then he says, and that's what the meaning behind the famous embraces, when you're with a partner and you grip them really hard and you try and squeeze them. Hold me tight, he says. Serre-moi fort. Knowing that it is totally futile and impossible, we still try. And then he immediately adds, not too tight that you would kill someone, which is the kind of nice Lacanian joke at the end. So, hold me tight is, I think, the answer to Faladé.
Thanks, Sinan. Maura.
Hi. Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I had a question about kind of the relation to the universal. Specifically, I'm thinking like kind of Fanon in Black Skin, White Mask saying like, déjà l'homme veut me noyer dans l'universel. And he's saying, like, perhaps there's a horizon of universality, but like it's not possible to think that now. And that type of framing, especially in relation to the question of white and black, right? Specifically, he's talking about Africa, is not possible in this moment. So I guess I just was wondering about this kind of temporality and the question of the universal horizon or not.
I think that's a great question. I think I don't know if in Faladé there is a good response, and this kind of follows on from the previous question in many ways. It just depends to what extent you believe that the story of Mandela and de Klerk was successful, and two, whether the actual theory that underlies it is actually convincing enough. Are we happy with this idea that jouissance is a kind of shareable libidinal substance that gets out of balance, that some groups of people possess it more than other people? Is it possible to think jouissance at that level? I think, with some minor obstacles, I think that that's comprehensible. That seems reasonable to me. Do we think that, it's even worth dragging kind of, race relations scholarship or thinking about colonialism or post-colonialism? Is it even worth going down this route of, the really confused scholarship on Lacan and gender and, and kind of sexuality? Would it create even more problems? I don't know. I don't know what the answer to any of these questions are, to be honest. And I don't know how much closer we get to resolving the question. I think that she has a kind of beautiful idea, and it is a Lacanian idea ultimately, but she puts a good spin on it. So it depends to what extent your convictions believe in that Lacanian story. Fanon was writing in a different context to Faladé. It might be that an answer is that she feels that she has found the horizon, in a sense, in this kind of Lacanian way, a kind of optimism. Now, would that be exactly what we want to say? I don't know. But again, it would just depend. What do you think?
I don't know that I have any answers to that either. It's just kind of this, I think I'm interested kind of in Fanon's idea of the universal and kind of the contention with whether or not it's possible or thinkable or necessary. And I think it's like, if it's not, then it's a question of would we do a difference, right? Which seems to be the answer that she's providing. So it's less of like I have an answer, and more so that like that seems to be the question that needs an answer.
I think that Sophie Mendelssohn and Livia Boni's point was a pretty good one, which is the relationship of difference to difference, which taken all together, and this is Edouard Glissant, taken as a kind of whole, is a kind of connected, I don't want to use the word necessarily universal, but it's not a false universal. It is in its interconnected atomistic difference that it's a patchwork of a whole. I think that's a pretty good idea, and I think very much mirrors both Lacan and Faladé in this regard.
It does seem very attractive, but I think there is an element that comes back to Maria's point that there's a base materiality of inequality that, it's like, the rainbow nation's a lovely utopic idea, but if you don't address the fundamental economic disparities, then difference of difference is actually a difference of wealth. That's
I completely agree. Thank you both for highlighting that. And I also think there's this wonderful moment when Lacan is talking about colonization, I think in Seminar 17, but I don't quite remember. Let me see if I can find the quote. Oh, he says here, okay, so this is not in English. I found it, but this is not in English. He says, so I'll try and translate it in real time. He says, it was the unconscious that we had sold them at the same time of the laws of colonization. C'était l'inconscient qu'on leur avait vendu en même temps que les lois de la colonisation. Regressive, a regressive version of the master's discourse. and then he says, for this capitalism that we call imperialism, which is a remarkably dense and interesting quote. Both the relating of capitalism and imperialism, and also selling to formerly colonized people this idea of Oedipus. Anyway, it would merit further investigation. Oh, there you are, Derek.
No, it certainly does merit further investigation. But before we run out of time, we do have some hands up. So, Sinan.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sinan, for this fantastic talk. I did not know about Faladé's work, and I'm sure that I will order all of her books and try to get them in one by one. I have actually two questions, and you answered one of them partially, because one was this idea of jouissance that belongs to all, because I couldn't make the connection between the non-sexual rapport and a jouissance that would belong to all, because the non-sexual rapport is essentially not only related to the gender, but it is essentially our relationship with the real. And in our relationship with the real, we are all like irreducibly different. There's a jouissance there that cannot be cut, that cannot be castrated, that cannot be done anything with. And the way that I read gender is mostly through an identification rather than and something that belongs mostly to the symbolic rather than to the real. So I couldn't make that connection. And you said if we force it a little bit, maybe we can make it. But I think I do want to hear a little bit more on how we can truly push it to its limits. One other thing, the second thing is actually something that Calum started out the discussion with the concepts belonging to the Western world. And twice you repeated, we sold them our version of Oedipus, quoted Lacan saying that. So I have two partially different readings on it, because first of all, this discussion is coming to us from the 60s and 70s. And the academic and intellectual context is very different then. And we will still be able to talk about the importation and the application of the Western concepts to the non-Western countries. However, today we're in the moment of decolonization and decolonization of the university, decolonization of the academy. So I am wondering if it is more possible today to be thinking about Lacan and Faladé in that context, and whether or not you have any thoughts on it. And I think this is all that I have for now, but thank you so very much. Thanks.
No, you're welcome. Thank you so much for the question. I'm going to try to do them in reverse, partly because I remember the second question slightly better. I think that we cannot read that quote about selling them Oedipus without the necessary irony. I think Lacan is ironizing. And I think that I think part of what the talk was about was to situate these questions in the kind of 70s and 60s, as opposed to kind of having a kind of anachronistic view from now, looking back at Lacan and thinking, well, how can he be kind of post-colonial? And I think that's what's so interesting about the Faladé, because if you remember, I tracked her kind of early life and all the stuff that she was doing, which in many ways could be seen as doing kind of post-colonial stuff avant la lettre, if you want, which I think is interesting. And I think that the fact that Lacan kept her so close says something. We trade jabs about how Lacan was a heterosexist patriarch theoretician of human oppression, racist, sexist, homophobe, etc. I mean, again, none of these things are true, partly because most people are humorless, and partly because he's very badly understood, and that's very problematic. I don't know if I've answered that second question. Please forgive me if I haven't. I think that the answer to the first question is extremely complicated, but I think the way that I understand the real is a failure of symbolization, at least in most cases. The way that I understand gender in the Lacanian sense is, as you said, it's a kind of system of identification that's not in many ways tied to in any sense. I don't know, it's very complicated because again, even in gender there's a kind of tying into the real. If you think about autre jouissance, if you think about feminine sexuality as a kind of mystic force, I don't know, but I think that what Faladé means is that jouissance is something that needs to be castrated, like from a very kind of basic level, and that basically like some people have a psychotic, mythical horde level of jouissance. And so it's very much on the kind of masculine side that needs to be kind of like reined in. Without getting in too much into the intricacies of kind of like, you know, the specifics of jouissance. I think that's what she means. Does that sound reasonable to you?
Partially, yes, but not entirely. But that's probably just like I have to take up with Faladé herself.
Just like jouissance can only be enjoyed partially, you can only enjoy Lacan partially, anyway.
True, fair enough. Thank you.
I think you make a very good point there, but the historicity of it, you know, where we're situated in time, and but I wonder part of the answer to that is in the difference in language that the two of you use, because you used the word decolonialize, and Sinan in his response talked about post-colonialism, and kind of raised like, can we actually decolonize? Once colonization has happened, it's happened. You can't go back. So I wonder if there's still some relevance, you know, despite the fact we're half a century further on in time. You know, the ideas that Solange is talking about in terms of the importation of Western ideas has happened, and undoing that is, you know, I don't know if it's possible anymore. I mean, I'm not saying we can't move somewhere else, but we can't go back to what was, and that just becomes a fantasy. Just a thought. We're kind of running out of time a little bit here, but we've got two more hands up.
Yeah, thank you. So first, Sinan, that was wonderful. Thank you very much. As Sinan said, I didn't know anything about Faladé, and I'm really it was wonderful. Thank you. I have to insist a little bit precisely on what Sinan was saying. My question is very similar to hers. So first, I wanted to know if this idea of hoarding jouissance is originally from hers, or is it yours? That wasn't clear to me. But before you answer that, I really think I'm really happy you recovered Lacan's intervention on these three Togolese men he took into analysis. But I have to say, I was taken aback by your comment about Lacanian thought being dangerous, I think you said, to non-Western cultures or subjectivities. I have to say I strongly disagree with that. If that is what you propose and what you think Lacan thought at the time, I think precisely what you presented today, including his close friendship and his enormous respect for this colleague of his, would prove, and that comment about these Togolese men and the unconscious that we Europeans sold them, and this connection with their tribal traditions and so on. And I have to strongly disagree, Calum, with what you say about decolonization. I think that would be precisely the difference. I find it very interesting, this difference, how you said multiracial is not the same as liberal multiculturalism. And I think that difference is the effort of decolonial political activity, not only thought and theory, but precisely the praxis of decolonization, which is, of course, has nothing to do with going back to whatever ideal orientalized indigenous past, but on the contrary, I think the work of Quijano with the invention of race, and particularly in all the effort in Latin America by Latin American Lacanian psychoanalysts who have been writing and working to decolonize psychoanalysis, not to bring back some lost ideal, magical wisdom, but on the contrary, to operate in order to move against that terrible form of alienation that Lacan signals there when he describes imperialism as a regressive form of capitalism. And I think that's a jab against Lenin, by the way. But yes, I think there are marvelous works in Latin America by Latin American Lacanians who would strongly disagree if we would say that Lacanian psychoanalysis cannot be operated outside westernized subjectivities or westernized cultural contexts.
Thank you so much for your question and comment. I think that there's been a kind of misunderstanding. I don't think I said that specifically, but I do think that Lacan says a version of that himself. It's not that psychoanalysis is inapplicable. It's that psychoanalysis without context is fruitless. So that in order to apply a kind of Lacanian understanding of human subjectivity necessitates reinterpreting it for each culture. So I think that that's the kind of where we have had a kind of contresens misunderstanding. And I think that he talks about this in Littérateur. I don't remember exactly, but we can maybe discuss it. But yes, I completely agree. There's lots of really interesting, exciting stuff happening in Latin America. And I completely agreed with you actually about the point about decoloniality. Although I don't think necessarily it was against Calum, but I think you made a really good point. And I think that it could be that, to kind of go back to what Calum had said previously, it could be maybe we should think in terms of anti-colonization. But again, I don't know. Did I answer your question? I'm not 100% certain.
Yes, you did. And yes, I was taken aback in the sense that it was obvious because of the sense of your presentation that you were not stating, or that I thought it was obvious that you do not believe that psychoanalysis is unapplicable outside Europe, of course. But I think that is precisely the work of decolonization, is to do precisely what Lacan points to in that 1970 seminar, when he says, yes, these people are alienated from their culture, and we cannot expect them to either dream about their tribal traditions, but we cannot as well expect to analyze them as if they were only European.
Totally. Well, I completely agree with you.
Thank you.
Great. Thank
Wonderful
you.
lecture.
And we're going to go to Derek for our final question.
Oh, thanks very much. Sinan, thanks for a terrific talk. I think we're all indebted to you just for the incredible piece of historical scholarship. I mean, English-speaking Lacanians would probably take a long time to stumble upon this material. So thank you so much for that. And not just the historical work, but also the conceptual work that follows in the second part of the paper. Really, really terrific. We're much indebted. I suppose I just had one very brief comment, and that is to say, obviously I look a little excited and inspired, and that's because I am. I think one of the things I just wanted to emphasize that was so important in how you did speak about some of the ideas was that for Faladé, the enjoying of one's own difference is significant. I mean, that's important, right? Because otherwise, if it's the enjoyment of the other or the other's enjoyment, that's when we get all the standard kind of Lacanian theorizations of theft of enjoyment and racism. So just it might seem a small distinction, but I think it's enormously important. And the other thing I wanted to also say is I think that you did a great job with is that little moment of articulation to Glissant's notion of opacity and why that's so significant. And what I'm hoping that maybe it's not really a question for here and now. I suppose it's a bit late and we're tired, but there's some interesting conceptual work I'm hoping that will get done there, because when he is speaking about opacity, he says some other interesting things, right? He talks about the right to opacity. He talks about opacity as something which gets in the way of the colonial visibility, the race in the scopic dimension of coloniality. So opacity is a resistance to visibility. It's a right to opacity. It's opacity outside a logic of possession. It's in some senses a resistance to being assimilated to a kind of homogeneity. So that's why you're using it, because it fits with so much of Faladé's argument. But I suppose my question then is, the right to opacity, I think, is also a right to enjoyment, and a right to one's enjoyment that remains opaque to others. And anyway, so that's what I'm kind of wondering, whether I don't know enough about how Glissant spoke about opacity, but I'm just so curious and hopeful that there's a way of building on that some ethics of jouissance and a kind of right to enjoy. And I'm a little hesitant, just actually, now that I say that, because now that I think about it, like, the more one engenders opacity, doesn't then one also kind of reiterate the otherness of enjoyment? So maybe there's some problems to be worked out there. But just to say that it sounds like an important conceptual link, and thank you again for making it for us. I'd love to hear more about it at some point.
Thank you so much, Derek. Honestly, I probably can't do more on that right now, partly because it's late and I'm tired. But I think the way that you put it was actually perfect. And I think that you're absolutely right that there is something to be done here. And I'm indebted to Serene, my sister, who pushed me in this direction. So thank you to her. But I would be really interested to keep working in this direction. Anyway, Derek, you know, I hope that was an answer, but it was more just, I'm just in awe of you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Derek. Thank you, Sinan. Thank you for everyone joining us. We've gone a little bit over time, so it's probably a very good place to stop. But thank you very much for joining us for our first Lacan in Scotland of the new academic year. We will continue throughout this academic year having Lacan in Scotland on the last Thursday of every month. So if you're new to Lacan in Scotland, please come back. If you haven't signed up to Lacan in Scotland, if you go to our website, you can sign up there and you should get updates for all the new events. So you can follow us on X or Facebook or Instagram and possibly a few other places. And we'll try and get information to you. But for now, thank you very much. Thank you for the rest of the team in Lacan in Scotland. Lovely to see you all here, and hopefully see you at the end of October.
Thank you so much, Calum.
Thank you, Sinan.